first streetlight blinked off exactly when the clay mask touched the woman's face, and every dog on Maple Ridge stopped barking at once. Lila Vance crouched inside a hedge of dripping boxwoods, her scraped knees pressed into mulch, staring across the cul-de-sac like she had stumbled into the wrong world. Every mailbox along the curved suburban lane shone with the same dead rabbit gray, wet and smooth, as if the night had licked them clean. The smell that led her there still clung to the air, a greasy braid of beeswax, burned rosemary, and something sweetly rotten underneath. In the deepest backyard, beneath a sagging basketball hoop wrapped with white ribbon, her neighbors stood in a pale circle wearing cream robes over carpool clothes. Their loafers and sneakers poked from the hems, and one woman still had a school volunteer badge pinned crookedly to her chest. No one spoke while they traded casserole dishes, salad bowls, and foil-covered platters for thumb-pressed clay masks arranged on a plastic patio table. Each mask looked different at first glance, then strangely identical when Lila squinted, as if every face had been flattened by the same hand. The ritual moved with the stiff politeness of a bake sale, but the silence around it felt packed and swollen, ready to burst. At the center of the lawn stood a bird bath, filled not with water, but with gray paint, reflecting the dying light like liquid skin. The second streetlight flickered twice and went dark, and a man in golf shorts raised both hands toward the sky as though receiving a blessing. Lila spotted Mrs. Hargrove from the corner house, lifting her dinner plate with trembling fingers, revealing a coil of braided hair underneath the roast. Another woman laid down a pie and accepted a mask carved with shut eyelids, then pressed it over her face without hesitation. When the third streetlight blinked, the whole cul-de-sac dimmed into bruised purple, and the painted mailboxes seemed to brighten from within. Lila backed deeper into the hedge until a thorn scraped her wrist, because she had finally seen what sat inside the birdbath paint. Floating just below the surface were house keys, wedding rings, and rows of baby teeth glimmering like chipped pearls. The man in golf shorts tipped a beeswax candle over the basin, and the wax spread in white swirls that somehow sank instead of floated. One by one, the robed neighbors lifted their masks and turned toward the dark street, waiting for the remaining lights to answer. Then a new car rolled into the cul-de-sac without headlights, silent except for gravel crunching under the tires like cracking bone. The station wagon stopped beside the Vance mailbox, and Lila bit her knuckle when she saw who stepped out into the haze. Naya Ramlal emerged first, her soaked shawl clinging silver-threaded and dark against her shoulders, a lacquered veil box balanced carefully in both hands. Ivo followed with his damp canvas bag hanging low against his black shirt, his hollow face lifted toward the flickering lamps like he recognized the pulse. Isha climbed out last in mud-stained field clothes, gripping her crowbar, with bridal bangles looped around her wrist like they had been slipped there in panic. The back door opened, and the bride stepped onto the asphalt in drenched bridal cloth, muslin scarf, stitched thin and silver across the hidden mouth. Behind her came the bride's father, gray as chimney ash and folded with weakness, one hand braced against the car as if even the suburb's neat air hurt him. Lila had never seen these people before, yet they looked impossibly misplaced, as though rain had washed them from another country into her cul-de-sac. The neighbors did not rush or gasp when the strangers arrived, and that stillness frightened her more than screaming would have. Mrs. Hargrove carried a clay mask forward in both hands like an offering, and the other robed figures bowed their heads toward Naya's box. Naya did not bow back, and her dark almond eyes moved over the painted mailboxes, the bird bath, and the extinguished streetlights with tightening dread. Ivo stepped nearer the curb and noticed a spiral scratched into the wet asphalt, fresh and deep, beginning at the storm drain and circling outward through every driveway. Isha's jaw hardened when she saw children's bikes parked neatly at the sidewalk, each front wheel painted the same rabbit gray as the mailboxes. The fourth streetlight snapped dark, and all the masked neighbors turned their faces together toward the bride. The bride froze beside the station wagon, henna'd fingers knotting in her wet fabric, while her father sagged, as if the darkness had taken strength directly from his ribs. Naya shifted the veil box behind her back, but a little silver latch flashed, and every masked face tilted toward it at once. Lila watched one of the masks crack open at the mouth, though she was certain it had been solid clay seconds earlier. Bees began crawling from the cracked mouth and gathering on the woman's robe, tracing black lines across cream cloth without drawing blood. Ivo slid his canvas bag from his shoulder and unzipped it just enough for Lila to glimpse mirrored glass, receipt paper, and a red wooden chair leg jutting absurdly from the darkness. Isha moved one step in front of the bride's father and rolled the crowbar in her palm like a woman deciding how many bones she was willing to break. A wind passed through the cul-de-sac carrying rainwater, pond algae, and rosemary smoke, and every painted mailbox turned slowly toward the center of the street. Lila nearly cried out when she realized they were not turning on hinges, but bending at the posts as if soft beneath the skin of paint. The neighbors knelt in unison before the leaning boxes, masks lifted to the sky, and the fifth streetlight went out with a shudder. Under the lawn of the Hargrove house, something enormous shifted, raising the sod in a long moving ridge from garden bed to swing set. The basketball hoop trembled, then bowed toward the bride, as though pulled by invisible hands below the earth. Naya finally opened the lacquered box a single inch, and thin strips of wet bridal veils glimmered inside like captive moonlight. The masks all inhaled together with a dry sucking sound, and the bee-covered woman lurched forward until Mrs. Hargrove caught her shoulders. Ivo looked not at the cult, but at the windows of the surrounding homes, where families stood behind curtains with plates in their hands, waiting their turn. In every window, the watchers wore ordinary clothes and utterly blank faces, as though terror had already been bargained away. Lila understood then that the whole cul-de-sac was involved, not only the people on the lawn, and her stomach went cold enough to hurt. The bride's father lifted one shaking hand toward Naya's box, but before his fingers touched it, he pointed instead at the storm drain. Rainwater began bubbling through the metal grate in thick gray blisters, each bubble smelling of candle wax and old soil. A child's small hand pressed upward from beneath the water, pale and paint-slick, then vanished before anyone but Lila seemed willing to react. Lila scrambled backward in horror, and her sneaker snapped a branch that cracked through the backyard silence like a gunshot. Every mask turned toward the hedge at once, 30 clay faces moving with one animal jerk. The final streetlight flickered above the cul-de-sac, throwing brief flashes over Lila's terrified face as she crouched exposed between the boxwoods. Mrs. Hargrove raised one finger toward her, and the cracked mask on her face began dripping gray paint that writhed like living mucus. Isha moved faster than anyone else, swinging the crowbar into the painted birdbath and exploding the basin across the lawn in a storm of teeth, keys, and wax. The neighbors reeled backward, but the gray paint did not splash down and die. It rose in ropes, suspended in the air like strings being pulled by invisible puppeteers. Ivo tore a mirror shard from his bag and angled it toward the floating paint, and for one sickening second, the cul-de-sac reflected a different neighborhood beneath it. In that reflected place, Maple Ridge was roofless and drowned, its lawns peeled away, its families kneeling inside a giant circular excavation lined with mailboxes like grave markers. Naya flung the veil box open, and rain-soaked bridal cloth unfurled into the air, wrapping around the suspended paint as if smothering a fire. The bride stepped forward before anyone could stop her and pressed both henned palms against Mrs. Hargrove's mask. Silver stitches flashed across the muslin scarf where the bride's mouth should have been, and new silver lines spread from her hands into the clay. The mask fused shut around Mrs. Hargrove's face, and every other neighbor screamed for the first time, clutching their masks as hairline cracks raced over them. Beneath the street, the unseen thing heaved again, harder, and the entire cul-de-sac sank by inches, driveway concrete splitting in wet, jagged lines. Lila ran from the hedge toward Naya without thinking, because the storm drain beside the curb was already bulging upward with tiny finger-shaped dents. Naya caught the girl by the shoulders and shoved her behind Ivo, then looked down with horror at Lila's wrist, where the hedge thorn had drawn blood. The blood on Lila's skin had turned the same dead rabbit gray, creeping in a thin ring around the scratch like fresh paint drying. Around them, every mailbox bowed lower and pointed inward like kneeling witnesses, while the broken streetlights flickered weakly against a prayer that still had not ended.